And welcome to the panel on analytics. I'm Rasmus Kleis Nielsen. I'm Director of Research at the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism. If any of you are mid-career journalists looking for a chance to spend 6 months in Oxford, have a look at our fellowship program. We also do research which aims to help journalists and the media industry navigate a rapidly changing world. I'm very pleased to have a panel today with Federica Cherubini, who was my co-author on a report we did on analytics earlier this year that's available for download on the Institute website. We also have some hard copies here if people are interested. And some of the people who are leading the development of what we in the report call editorial analytics. So analytics that aren't simply about using numbers to try to generate a few more page views, but about using data to do better journalism and help journalists get that journalism in front of the right people for editorial purposes, but also to underpin the organizational goals of specific news organizations. So Aaron Pilhofer works at The Guardian with these amongst many issues, Renee Kaplan at the Financial Times, and Sebastian Horn at SET, a startup in Zeitverlag in Germany. I'll say just two things before I hand it over to Federica, who will present a few points from the report, and then we'll move around the panel to hear some perspective on how this is done. It's clear, and I think most of you will recognize this from your own professional conversations, that there is a significant number of journalists who are very uneasy about the idea of newsrooms embracing audience data as a way of informing their decision making. And it's long been the case that within news organizations, there was a very asymmetrical situation where the marketing people and the commercial people and management had access to a lot of data and made data-based and data-informed decisions, whereas newsrooms knew relatively little about their audience. Some people think this was a better world. Personally, I'm of the view that as the media environment we operate in gets more and more competitive, not knowing very much about your audience is very, very dangerous if you, as a journalist, want to reach them to make sure that your journalism makes a difference, but also from the point of view of your organization, whether it's a commercial one that needs to make money and hence need to reach people, or whether it's a public service organization that needs to reach the public, hence public service, to justify its existence. How you can use audience analytics to underpin this, Federica will talk about some of the takeaways from the research we did, and we will hear some perspectives from some of the organizations that are developing this right now. We thought it was very notable as we interviewed across Europe and North America in a range of different organizations that the use of analytics, which in the past may have been associated with brands like BuzzFeed or Gawker or the Huffington Post, increasingly we see, at least in our view, the most sophisticated analytics work being done by organizations that I think most of us would recognize have a very different value proposition and a very different style and quality of journalism, like the ones represented here today, The Guardian, the Financial Times, SET, but also others, Die Welt in Germany, the BBC in the UK. So tools that some may have associated with a quite frothy type of online journalism are now underpinning some of the best news organizations in the world. And what you think about that as a journalist, I think from my point of view, depends quite a lot on what you think of journalism as a profession and what you think of the people that you are trying to reach. If you think that journalism is perfect and people are stupid, then I can understand why you don't want to know more about what people like and what people want and what people feel make their lives better. Because if people are stupid and you are perfect, then being more informed about what they want will make your journalism worse. Now, I'm a scientist, so I guess I'm in principle open to the proposition that some journalists are not perfect. I hold this up as a hypothesis. I'm not saying that you're not perfect, but I'm willing to entertain the idea that some of you, or some journalists outside this room, are not perfect. I'm also of the view, and I think we have a little bit of evidence to suggest that this is not just a flight of fancy from my point of view. I'm also of the view that not everyone in the audience is stupid. So if you move towards that world where journalists are not perfect and people are not stupid, and you accept that the people you're trying to reach have many, many different offerings competing for their attention, then it may actually be quite useful to know something about them and what they are doing, what's the context in which they use your content, your journalism, what are the ways in which they feel that it adds value to their life, informs them, empowers them, make their lives better. And I think we see some very clear examples of that now being done in sophisticated organizations across Europe and North America, where analytics is used not to override editorial decision making, but to inform it and to empower journalists to become better journalists and get their journalism in front of more of the right people. So I think we'll hear some examples of this from the panel, and then I hope we'll have a good discussion, because I think there is a useful tension, if you will, between more data-informed perspectives and journalistic priorities, but also one where it's worth looking for common ground looking forward. So with that, I'll hand it over to Federica.
Thank you, Rasmus. So we spoke to those in newsroom working with analytics, people with title like audience editor and audience engagement, audience development editor, growth editors, to try to understand, to have a picture of what people are doing and what direction are they taking. And we defined editorial analytics as the approach that moved beyond the generic use of off-the-shelf tools to develop a tailored approach that is aligned with the editorial priorities and the organizational structure of each organization. So a tailored approach means that you know what you're trying to do, you have a strategy, and you use the data to underpin that. That means not just using the tools, because there is no shortage of tools. So many newsroom, almost all newsroom are using some sort of analytic tool, either developed in-house or Charbit, NewsWeb, Parsley. That's not a problem anymore. But many newsrooms still use that in a very rudimental way, and they not really go beyond a daily plug-and-play tool that is focused on just a short-term optimization, moving the content around the homepage, trying to optimize the headline, but they not really combine with the long-term goals. Also, best practice are those that acknowledge that the field is in constant evolution and data has some limits. So we found 3 criteria that underpinned editorial best practice in editorial analytics. So, and that means that it is about tools as much as it is about culture and organization. And one is no substitute for the other. So you need good tools. You need to be able to read properly the data. You need to be able to have people understand the data. But you need to have a right place for the data in the organization and a culture that underpins that, not just in management, but throughout the journalists and the organization. Of course, good analytics can help the newsroom understand the audience and to get the people, to get the journalists in front of the right people and more of the right people. But the most sophisticated teams are those who are very aware that analytics are not perfect. Some things are very difficult to measure and to compare. Knowing what good looks like is more difficult than what it can look like. And the data does not speak for themselves, like numbers, metric, need a context. You need an objective, and you have to set the right metric to try to define. Once you have defined that objective, you have to set the right metric to measure it. And that means that benchmarking is very difficult, especially when you're trying to benchmark between different platform, devices, formats. Not all the off-site platform have the same kind of data. And also, we found that the tools and the metric that many newsrooms are still using, not just many newsrooms, the industry is still using tools and metrics that work very well for the internet in 2011, but are not moving fast enough as the industry is moving. So in the report, we advocate for use of data in the newsroom, but we also want to underline that it's not just about following the number and replacing the editorial judgment with just numbers. So it's quite a contrary. It's about taking editorial decisions supported by what the data tells you. And compared to years ago, where the industry had a vague idea of what people were reading and how and what they're doing with the content, now that's possible. So that's just one further element to really be able to build an editorial, to make an editorial decision around it. And it's important for us that journalists also take this seriously, because the alternative is not a word with no analytics. It's impossible right now to just stop thinking that we are going to look at the data. But the alternative is analytics shaped by advertising, commercial, tech companies that have very little interest in good journalism. So that's why in the report we really advocate for a presence of the journalist sphere into this field.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Federica. We'll hear now from some of the people who are developing these tools for editorial and organizational purposes across different organizations. So I think we should start with you, Aaron, and hear from The Guardian, from the front lines.
All right. So I'm just going to talk for a couple of minutes because we want to have a lot of time for questions, and I know we're going to have a lot of questions because this is always a very contentious topic, particularly with among journalists. And actually, maybe every time I say that, you know, sometimes that is the case. Sometimes you get into these discussions about, oh my God, data is evil. You give it to the newsroom, and our world is going to stop rotating, and the sky is going to fall, and everything's going to end, and your site's going to turn into nothing but cat videos. And so, having been in an organization that felt that way for 9 years, and having had conversations there that would blow your mind about how journalists think about data and how they think people are interacting with their content. I mean, just things that are just totally made up. Things, you know, this is the problem. When data is not inherently evil, right? Data is just data. Data, its limitations, as long as you understand what it is good for and what it's not good for, it isn't inherently evil. How we use it, it could be evil. So this is fundamentally the problem, I think, in newsrooms, is in some respects, it's not necessarily always the lack of data. It's often the abuse of data, or laziness, I would even say, around data. Does it align with your strategy? Does it align with your editorial strategy? How you use data, does that actually, do you know you're moving your organization to some defined point? Do you even know what your editorial strategy is? Does anyone know what your editorial strategy is? Does anyone know how to create a strategy? I mean, these are kind of fundamental things, and these are not things that typically happen in newsrooms. And this is why the data piece is so important, because I believe we are now moving into an era where you look at our competitors, and our competitors are not our traditional peers. Our competitors are monstrous organizations like Facebook and Google. They are upstarts like BuzzFeed, Quartz, things, and even HuffPo, although they're struggling lately. And these are all organizations that are insanely data-driven, top to bottom. Everything they do is data-driven. And we shouldn't just look at this and say, ooh, we don't want to be like that. We should look at this and learn. We have to, in fact. We don't have a choice. We are in a time when we have to compete with these organizations. All of them have a very clear-cut strategy. And we've talked about this, actually at this conference many times even, that the thing to look at about BuzzFeed is not the cat videos. The thing to look at about BuzzFeed is how they use data to create how their editorial strategy and how their business strategy and how their data platform, all of these things work together to make BuzzFeed what it is today. You don't have to create BuzzFeed. Just because you use data doesn't mean you will inevitably end up being BuzzFeed. Those two things, that is not true. But if we don't have the data component, if we don't have the strategy, and we don't have some sense, some visibility into whether we are making progress toward an objective editorially, then we're dead. Because that's the only reason anybody wants to pay for news, is because you are helping them in some way. You're providing a service, you're providing value. And that's how we should be using data. So at The Guardian, we just got done with a fairly deep, many month-long deep dive into creating a strategy, a new strategy. And our strategy used to be very much about growth, and it used to be about reach, and it used to be very much about just as many clicks as you could possibly garner. And if you and so that was how Guardian went from being, you know, the 9th largest newspaper in the UK out of 10 to being, you know, 150 million or so global uniques. But the problem is that very soon you realize that actually big isn't that big. 150 million global uniques feels pretty big. But on a daily basis, Facebook has more people logging into Facebook than we get in page views in a month. And that should really give you all pause about this idea that it's just about clicks, because it's not. So our new strategy is more about relationships. It's more about a small number of deep relationships, and actually it looks a lot more like the FTs than it does the previous iteration of the Guardian strategy. And if we don't have data that tells us, are we actually succeeding? Are we moving forward? Then we're dead. We don't know. We're flying blind. And that is where we have to be as an organization. That's where I feel the only way we can compete at a time when it's even more and more difficult to be a general interest news site online. That's where we have to be. So I guess I'll just leave it at that.
Thanks very much, Aaron. It's really, I think, an interesting and important example of an organization that's widely recognized as being very sophisticated about digital, also having to reevaluate quite a lot of different things that you're doing when one element of the strategy changes in terms of sort of moving from a primary focus on advertising to also thinking about membership and what that means for your relationship to your audience. So this is something I think Federica and I found across the many interviews we did for the report, that some of the organizations that are most sophisticated are also most self-critical, most aware of their own shortcomings, most aware of the shortcomings of the data that they use, the tools that they have, and most aware of the constant need for change, whereas some organizations that we won't name anyone, but that we wouldn't necessarily hold up as examples of best practice, sort of feel they got it nailed in 2012 and don't really need to look back. And I think that's a slightly dangerous way of thinking about it. Renee, do you use data in evil ways at the FT?
Every day we use it in evil ways at the FT.
That's James, by the way, James.
Exactly. Can you hear me? When I think about data, I often think about how I used to be afraid of data. And in fact, I kept on wondering, what is data? Like, why do we need to talk about data in the newsroom? Why is everyone saying data? And data is essentially numbers, and it's really less about data than what you're measuring, and all the numbers that metrics and whatever you're trying to measure produces. Which then begs the question of, well, what as a newsroom, what as news organizations are we trying to measure? Or trying to measure how we're doing? I mean, we hear that all the time now in newsrooms. How did that do? You know, writers, reporters, editors, even the ones who are very digitally unfriendly. Well, how did I do? Well, the question of how I'm doing comes back to what am I doing, which comes back to Aaron's really good point about strategy. And strategy is not something typically that is journalist and that we've thought about wanting to do. Journalism is about storytelling and a mission, and values can be lots of different things, lots of different people. It has rarely been about strategy. One of the interesting things about the Financial Times, which is very different from The Guardian, is that we have always been a paid content media, and it's a very premium, very expensive media. And also one of the rare qualities of the FT, at least in today's ecosystem, is that it's a profitable media. So you can believe that someone, not the newsroom, but someone at the FT for a long time has been thinking about strategy, because there is a commercial strategy, and it's imperative and vital that the Financial Times remain viable and remain profitable. So on the commercial side, the strategy is very clear. We need to make money, and we need to make money that in a sustainable fashion. The massive difference, and this may sound simplistic, but it defines the whole notion of data in the newsroom, the massive change is suddenly the strategy that's been driving the commercial side of the business needs now to inform to some extent what we're doing in the newsroom. So the strategy, you know, data for us at the FT is very simple. It's about figuring out ways in which we can translate into editorial proxies, into things that make sense for journalists, into things that make sense for the newsroom, what the bigger picture goals and objectives, what the bigger picture strategy of the organization is. And again, for the FT, that's pretty simple. We need to get our journalism out in front of more audiences, more people, but more of the right people. So who are the right people? Well, the right people are people who are most likely to be impacted by our content, who are most likely to get value out of it, and who are most likely somewhere down the road to pay for it. So all the things that we're trying to measure editorially are the things that give us a sign that someone is getting value out of this content, and enough value that eventually they'll want to pay for it. And again, the objectives in the newsroom aren't about subscriptions. It's not, that would be the collapsing of the church into the state, and that would be evil. That's not what we're doing. I think the idea is that we need to now figure out in the newsroom, okay, if quality reach, i.e. reaching more audiences that are a certain type of audience, that I know something about, that I know we're going to get value out of my content, if that's my goal, if quality reach is my goal, how does that inform the decisions I'm making in the newsroom? And what I'd like to say to our newsroom is look, there was a time when it was just enough to be there. It was enough just to distribute the content, to publish, and we were done. But what's shifted now, and what I'm trying to use data and metrics in the newsroom to do, is help the newsroom understand that being there is not enough. You're actually now, being there for your audience used to be what we did. It's now about being in a relationship with your audience. And in fact, again, as Aaron was saying, it's a different kind of relationship that needs to be measured. And being in a relationship, as anybody who's been in one knows, well, being there is actually not enough. Otherwise, the other person gets a little bit frustrated, wondering how you feel, how you're doing. Are we building this? Are we getting value out of it? Are we getting satisfaction? Are we getting delight out of this relationship? So metrics in the newsroom are all the different ways that as journalists and as editors, we can gauge the kind of relationship that we're in with our audience. So it's no longer just a question of performance. It's a question of understanding something about the audience. So performance are page views, it's uniques, and those are still really important, right? Because every media in the world, whether you're the FT, the Guardian, or Zet, you want to get out in front of lots of people. But then you want this to be a specific kind of person, and you want these people to be doing specific kinds of things that you know are going to give you the sign that they're getting value or not out of what you're doing. So it's now about adding other metrics into an integration with page views. It's about the time spent with your content. It's about how far did I scroll down, or how much, or how much did I click through to the many links in your content? Did I share it? Did I like it? Did I comment on it? Did I stick around on your website to read other content after reading that story because I got a valuable enough experience out of it? All of these add up to what is a bigger picture view of not just how the content did, right? I.e., how am I realizing my strategy? It's also about figuring out things about your audience. It's also about understanding not just how your story did as a journalist, but also who is my audience. So again, we talk a lot about data in the sense of performance, and that's probably the hardest way to talk about data in the newsroom, because the notion of having to associate journalism with performance, again, seems kind of counterintuitive or antithetical or heretical to some people. But data and metrics are also about just knowing stuff about your audience, and it's very powerful. And frankly, to journalists, it's incredibly gratifying. Who are they? Where are they? Geographically, demographically, on what devices are they reading my content? Where are they most coming to me from? Is it via search? Is it via social? All of these are also aspects of data and metrics that are actually incredibly gratifying to journalists, mostly because journalists we're all incredibly narcissistic. We just want to know one thing. How did my story do, and who's reading me, and who will read more of me? Well, there's a way in which data and metrics can actually be a very powerful motor at a very primal level of what any journalist wants to do anyway. So I don't think we do evil, actually, ever in the newsroom. I actually think that data and metrics are an incredibly useful, powerful tool for doing good.
It's clear that as we sort of interviewed across, in particular across continental Europe, that one response that we would get in many newsrooms, and we have the same when we talk about this research with journalists and organizations, is, well, that's all very fascinating, but the Guardian is a big organization, the FT is a big organization, and we can't possibly do that in my newsroom. We're too small. So what's worth thinking about here is that's a question of resource allocation. It's not a question of size. I mean, when we talk to Quartz, for example, Quartz has, I think, about 80 people working at Quartz, and of those 80 people, 4 people are full-time work in areas of audience engagement, audience development, audience growth. So, the question of size, a quite relative one. Many of you will work in organizations that have more than 80 full-time staff members and do not have 4 people who work on data and how data can inform editorial decision making. And I think a particularly interesting example of this is SET, which Sebastian has been involved in starting up, which is a quite small startup, but also one that tries to work very systematically with data. So I guess, Sebastian, first of all, I think after what Renee said, we really want to know, do you delight your audience, and how do you measure this?
Yes, we do every day.
Fantastic. We're very satisfied.
So yeah, we built SET completely from scratch last year. We are live now for 8 months. We're a small startup within a big publisher, but we got our own team, our own newsroom, our own office space, and we really had the freedom to make our own decisions from the start. And data was a really important part of this. So for me, it's almost impossible to imagine that you launch something like that without thinking about data, because as a startup, maybe more than a legacy publisher, you want to know how you're doing and whether you reach people from the start, and whether the strategy and the content strategy that you laid out is actually working or not. So from the start, we were looking very closely at numbers and at data in our newsroom, and I just want to go through 5 things that, in preparing for this, kind of stuck out for me that I learned in the last 8 months. The one is, and I can just repeat what Aaron and everybody else was saying, that numbers and audience data without clear goals and a context that you're operating in are literally just numbers and extremely useless. So just to give a very, very simple example, we see how many people are currently on our website, and that's a number in Google Analytics. But how are you supposed to know whether that's a lot or just a few when you're a startup? You have no experience whatsoever. So we had to kind of define, so there's a couple hundred. Is that a lot right now? Can we be happy, or should we be sad about this? So you need context and clear goals, and that goes for any platform that we publish on. The second one is I would advise, or I would, if I was ever to build such a product again, I would just try to measure literally everything. And before you build features, before you build products, think about how you're going to measure the success of what you're building. We weren't always successful with this, and this can be quite painful. So sometimes at the end of the month, we would run a report and find that we don't have the data to answer the questions. And then we manually had to go back and, for example, go through a spreadsheet and fill out cells with the month that an article is published in, for example, just to run the analysis that we want to run. And I would just emphasize to collect as much data as possible, because sometimes you don't know what the question is going to be that you will ask yourself in 3 months down the line. Third point is, don't overwhelm yourself with data in your everyday newsroom work that you're doing. So a simple tool like Google Analytics, well, I say simple, but that can give you so much information as you work every day. And for us, it was an extremely important process to figure out what the editors should be looking at and what the most important metrics are every minute of the day. And we built a custom dashboard that reflects what's important for us, that kind of reflects the most important traffic sources, and that we can use in real time to optimize what we're doing in that particular minute. So I said collect as much data as possible, but I would also say be very specific about the data that you display kind of by default to your editorial staff. At the same time, I would also say do take the time to run those long-term reports. One of the most useful exercises we did in recent weeks was to go through every single article we published in March, to actually have a list of them and see where they got their traffic from, what the most successful articles were, but also what the 10 least successful articles from that month were, and then to say, why didn't they work? And that was an extremely interesting discussion that went into many different directions, because the reasons were workflow reasons, they were headline reasons. Sometimes the picture was bad, sometimes we thought, nah, the topic's just not interesting to our audience. But it was a very creative exercise that helped us a lot to improve and to work differently in the future. Fourth point is, everything I just said, the first 3 steps, do the same for every social platform that you're on. So that's an extremely interesting point for me. So we do the same with Facebook data these days. We try to be as social as possible. So, do those long-term analysis on Facebook. What kind of posts work? Why do you think they worked? How do you generate reach on Facebook. And maybe we can talk about this a bit in the discussion, but our analytics are extremely spread out at the moment. So if I was to get a picture of how we're doing at the moment, I would have to log into Google Analytics, I would have to check Facebook Insights, I would have to check YouTube Analytics, maybe check Twitter. Combining all this data to get a big picture and make sense of it is time consuming and definitely still a great challenge for us. And lastly, the fifth point is, I like this term that you use at The Guardian, to be data informed, and I thought a bit about what it means for a newsroom to be data informed, and I think what you need is a team that shares a common context. So the first point that I was trying to make, that everybody's aware of what the goals are, and everybody can say, I'm looking at this number, and it's a good number, or it's a bad number. Second one, and this to me is always the easiest, is tools. I mean, once you know what you try to measure and what's important, it is so easy to pick a tool that can give you that data. You just have to check what the requirements are, and there are many different options that you can use for that. But it's important to have those tools and for everybody to have access to these tools. And finally, it's definitely a question of mindset. I'm just very lucky that everybody on my team is very young and very interested in data and narcissistic in a sense as well. They want to know how their articles are doing, how SET as a young startup is doing. So they do log into Google Analytics to see what the current numbers are. And I think if you combine those three, which roughly aligns, I think, with what your report says, you have a pretty good chance of using data effectively.
We've had both Federica's review of what we thought we learned from the interviews we did across North America and mostly Western Europe, and we've had three very open perspectives from people who are working with this. So this is probably the point where we should open up and get some questions or comments from people in the room to hear about more experiences, more perspectives on this. There are volunteers with microphones, so if you have a question, raise your hand, and then please identify yourself when you ask your question.
Hi, my name is Stefan Wehrmeier from Correctiv, and I want to ask a question of privacy. We were talking about having a relationship with the readers, but the readers also inadvertently have a relationship with US companies and lots of third-party tools that the media embeds. And especially from the European perspective, now that safe harbor, for example, is gone, is it just a legal and technological problem that can be solved by lawyers and, I don't know, people who deal with that stuff? Or should the editorial newsroom also think about that in some regard?
Renee, do you want to take this on? I mean, you get users to register in addition to your subscribers.
One of the advantages of being a subscription, a paid content business, is that obviously when you subscribe or even just register or trial, because indeed for just £1 or €1, you can trial the FT for just 1 month.
Just one.
We collect a lot of data, and the collection of data from a paid content business point of view is something we've been doing for a long time. So data compliance and privacy are incredibly rigid internal standards, because you're only as good as the data you can use. You're only as good as the audience information that you can actually leverage, that you're actually legally allowed to somehow use to inform your audience. So it's in a business's interest to make sure that there is a really rigid standard of data compliance in terms of what we collect as a business and what we use. As Seb pointed out, we're now all actually collecting data from lots of different platforms, right? So much of the reach strategy that any media has is going to now extend way beyond what we collect just on our own websites. It's going to be about all the content and all the different platforms: Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Snapchat, WhatsApp, although they don't give any data. All of those platforms are going to have different data issues, but they themselves presumably have filters of what they're giving you. And so the question really, frankly, is less from the media's perspective. It really is more from the user's perspective, and understanding, as all of us, as we consume any content, every click is probably a piece of information. I don't know if that answers your question.
David Levy from the Reuters Institute. You've all talked a lot about the difficulties of or not the difficulties, the issues involved in engaging journalists with data. What about the broader issue that everybody in the world is trying to hire data scientists at the moment, and news organizations may not necessarily be at the top of the pile in terms of the ability to pay? How do you tackle that? How do you lure the kind of people you want into your organizations, even if you may not be able to pay them as much as some other people?
Aaron, do you want to take this on?
Yeah, so we have two amazing data scientists who are not looking for new jobs. So just to be really clear about that. You know, this is a problem across the organization. It's a problem. So I wear two hats. I work in the newsroom. I run visual journalism, other things. But I'm also serving as the interim chief digital officer, so I'm also running product and technology. And we have the same exact problem there, where you have developers who are making, you know, in some cases, well, I won't say how much, but quite a bit less than they could elsewhere. And they're well aware of that. And people are drawn, you know, I think one thing that is in our favor is people are drawn to The Guardian because it's The Guardian. And, you know, thank God. Because that's really the only way we can bring in talent. The challenge there, though, is their sort of expectations of what do they do once they get to an organization like The Guardian. For a long time, what that meant was sequestering the technology team on a different floor, sequestering the data science team embedded in with the commercial side, never ever coming in contact with a journalist, never ever coming in contact with, I mean, let's be honest, with the core of what The Guardian is, with why they came to the organization in the first place. And so that's exactly what we're trying to unwind right now. And so we are now trying to build different ways to work in a much more cross-functional way to bring editorial, commercial, product, technology, and data science much closer together. Because frankly, at the end of the day, that is the only thing, well, that's one of the few things you can say, is that this is a really interesting area, right? I mean, just from the point of view of a data scientist who, you know, comes into an organization like The Guardian, I mean, this is like a fallow field that goes on forever, because we are hardly, as an industry, overwhelmed with data, you know, of our own creation. There is a lot of interesting work to be done there, as the report more than highlights. And so both being able to say, here is a really interesting problem to dig into, and by the way, you're here because you have some association affinity for journalism, you will have, you know, a job that will, that'll in many ways allow you to, you know, be part of The Guardian. Those are the two ways we've been able to retain people. It's really the only way. So
there's a gentleman in a checkered shirt here in the front.
Hi, my name is Dominik Wonig. I work for the German member-based site Krautreporter, and I have a question for Rethinking. Can you give us some insight?
I think your microphone may not be on.
Okay, does it work now? Yeah. So I have a question for you, René Kaplan. How do you measure, can you give us some insights, what metrics do you use to measure relationships and the funnel from going into like closing a membership, and what metrics do you use for that?
Sure. Again, the metrics, for example, that a commercial side of the business, that the marketing side would be using to understand exactly who is a likely user to eventually pay for content, like who has a propensity to subscribe. That's an extremely sophisticated machine that businesses like the FT has been using and doing for years. And that's very useful for a place like the FT for the newsroom, because we can now basically figure out, okay, the commercial side of the business knows that after a user has come back a certain number of times in a certain period of time and consumed a certain volume of content, they will probably most likely subscribe. That's actually, we call that, it's a recency, frequency, volume metric. And it's what the commercial side of our business calls our engagement metric. And we even have a number. 18.2, which obviously means nothing because, as Seb pointed out, numbers out of context mean nothing. But from a commercial side, if you have an engagement metric of 18.2 at the FT, you will probably subscribe. So that's great. For the newsroom, what does that mean? Who cares? Well, what we then tried to figure out and put in our data tool is what are all the different editorial metrics that are the equivalents of that kind of recency and frequency and volume that will lead eventually to subscription. And the way we're translating that, and it is a work in progress. We don't have the absolute science or art or insight on this. And we just recently launched a new data tool about a month ago. And so some of the metrics that we think are the editorial versions of that kind of engagement that will lead to subscription are page views, time spent, how far you scroll down the page, how much you're sharing it and liking it and commenting on it, how much you're consuming other content of that brand or on that platform. Are you then actually going to come back again within a certain amount of time? And this is even something that we're encouraging our journalists to look at, which is, all of those metrics journalists get. Oh, it's like, you're understanding more of my content, you're coming back for it more, you're consuming more of my content. We're even asking them now to look beyond that and think about topics. Can I associate certain topics with certain regions and certain geographies? And we're asking them to do this on social and on site. And this is obviously a lot of work from an engagement team to be able to deliver this back to the newsroom. But all of those are essentially the editorial proxies of what is ultimately that commercial metric leading to a subscription.
There's a...
Hi, I'm Jessica Gresco. I'm a reporter for the Associated Press. Maybe because I'm an AP reporter, I ask an inverted pyramid question, but we all expect that, readers are going to drop off. We write that way. But what counts for you guys as a success in terms of keeping a reader scrolling down the page?
Sebastian, have you looked at this at set?
See, where the point I'm completely honest with is we're not looking at that that metric at the moment. So probably Aaron can answer that. But engagement success for us would be that people actually comment on our articles and send us emails, which works really well. I mean, we didn't expect this, but at the bottom of an article, we would sometimes say, if you have any feedback or if you have anything to contribute to this topic, send us an email. And I expected hardly anyone to do that, but people do a lot. It's such an old school method, but so they must have scrolled to the very end of that article and opened their email tool to send us an email. So that's, for me, a very, very loyal and highly engaged user.
So we are tracking it, but we're not actually using it at this time, at least on the editorial side, as a clear metric. We have a sort of a proxy for it, which is median attention time, which is our flavor of the oh my God, Upworthy, thank you, metric, which it doesn't exactly measure scroll depth, but what it does measure is active reading. And that's a really interesting and useful metric. And by the way, it's incredibly humbling as well. When you do see it, you're nodding vigorously, you know what I'm talking about. When you see median attention time of like 15 seconds on a piece, it will really, and if you don't know what that means that half the readers spent less than 15 seconds on that piece. It can be a really eye-opening. It's a nice complement to page views in some ways, or I would even say antidote to page views.
Can I actually just add, it's probably useful, especially for the newsroom, not to necessarily focus on absolute targets, right? Because then if we were saying to every journalist, you have to have a 75% scroll rate, an average retention time of 1.2 seconds, and there need to be an average of X number of shares, then you're going down the evil route of the BuzzFeedization route. And BuzzFeed does very good things. But we do different things. I think what's probably most useful for any publication is having a comparative metric. It's not about getting to X level of anything. It's about how did this particular story do relative to how average stories on that topic do, or average stories that I write do, or average stories in this section do. And so one of the most useful functionalities that our new data tool has is this comparator tool, where it's not about, again, some absolute number, it's about relative to how usually I do, so that I know that I'm either doing as well as I do or better. And if I'm not doing as well and less well than I usually do, what can I do differently to change that?
So I just want to pop one more thing in there. This is where the data science piece is so crucial, because we recently, our data science team was messing around, playing around with something that we started doing at the New York Times, which is inspired by sabermetrics, fantasy baseball basically, where you look at a page and you can take into account promotion. You can sort of eliminate promotion from the equation, from the total. So you can say, like, a piece at the top of the page is obviously going to get more clicks than a piece at the bottom, and you can build a statistical model that'll take that into account and then normalize the data. That too has been incredibly helpful, because you can actually start to see not only did this piece do well or not do well, it did better than expected, or better than comparable piece promoted in this exact way over this period of time in this place. That's a much more important, crucial way to start looking at the success or failure of content, because for a long time we were just looking at clicks. And that just means stuff that was promoted heavily, for the most part, gets better clicks. So that's it.
There's a question here at the front.
Hello, my name is Lara Hüttenmoos. I work for 20 Minuten in Switzerland. I was wondering if you could give us some example how your content has changed based on data information, like specific examples or insights. Thank you.
I can sort of add to the previous question with that one. There's one area of content where we do look at how much time people spend with it, and that is video at the moment. So we started to look at, you can see this on Facebook and YouTube on a drop of time. So there you can sometimes see very clearly when people stop watching your video, and then you kind of skip to that point in the video and you realize, okay, makes sense. So the other day we do a video where you learn how to make something, or you can follow along. It's a tutorial, and then at the end we would have the editors just talking about the experience of making that or creating that, and people just stopped watching at that point because they were done, using the tutorial. And that made us realize, okay, so probably we either put that in the article or in the Facebook post, but the video is more effective, and if we leave that out of the video. So that's one example from set.
I mean, I can give an example. It's not from one of the organizations featured here, and is a few years old now, but John Stackhouse, the then editor of the Globe and Mail, one of the major national newspapers in Canada, a few years ago told about how the Globe and Mail ran the numbers on their website, and at the time they published maybe about 500 pieces of journalism every day, about 500 URLs every day. And they found that when they looked at numbers, I don't remember the exact figure, so don't take these as sort of gospel, but the figures were roughly that something like 85% of the articles they published every day generated less than 1,000 page views. And that at the Globe and Mail was sort of a moment for sort of quiet contemplation, if you will, of is there something we should do different if 85% of the articles we publish attract so little interest. And that can be about promotion, about how you think about social and how you think about various ways of getting your journalism in front of people, but it can also be a question of whether you are doing too much and not doing all of it well enough. So they pursued a strategy of doing a lot less online and try to promote what they did much better. So that's, if you will, a way of thinking about both the nature of the content itself, but also how you prioritize your resources across the balance between content creation, but also this idea, I think Renee sort of was indirectly speaking to this from the FT's point of view, that it isn't enough to just do it and publish it. I mean, there is quite a lot of work that can be done after that to make sure that when you've done a really good piece of journalism, it actually reaches some people. While people sort of collect their thoughts, I'm sure there'll be more questions and comments. I have a couple I wanted to sort of run by the panel to get some responses to. And the question you raised is sort of a version of one of them. In many organizations, I mean, Federica showed this sort of the continuum we describe in the report between what we call quite sort of rudimentary or generic analytics towards more sort of editorially informed analytics, more sophisticated approaches. In many organizations, analytics is still primarily about short-term day-to-day optimization. How can you generate more page views or a few more users? But in some organizations, analytics is also being used to inform more long-term strategy development and organizational decisions about how you organize the newsroom. The example I gave from the Globe and Mail is one example of that, but I think there will be others. So just ask each of the panelists to sort of speak to this question of maybe give us an example of how analytics in your organization has been used not only on a day-to-day basis to inform editorial decision-making and how you promote your content, but also to think about the nature of your work, how the newsroom is organized, what kind of work that you do. Aaron, do you want to take that on?
Yeah, so actually, as I was thinking about that question, we're in the process now of addressing our version of the 80% generating, n number of page views or less problem, and it's sort of difficult because you look at a problem like that and you say, well, we'll just stop doing 20%, the bottom 20%. The problem is, day to day, you never know what the bottom 20% is going to be. So we are actually now approaching this in two ways. One is we now have a clearly articulated, or I think anyway, clearly articulated editorial strategy, and we are now working through the process of developing metrics that support that strategy, so we know whether we are moving forward or not. And using those looking at it through that framework, we're now assessing all the content that we produce and saying, is this content actually something that we should be doing or shouldn't be doing? So we're looking at it more in terms of the class of content, not in terms of individual pieces, or not so much in terms of individual pieces. So I think, 3, 4, 5 months from now, I will have a much better answer to this question. But for us right now, it's more applying this framework, this strategy, and the supporting analytics behind it to what we do, in hopes of figuring out how to make The Guardian to actually improve overall what we do. Because promotion, sorry to keep going on here, but because promotion, it is a lot scarcer than people think. If you look at our homepage and what you would expect to see in terms of traffic for a piece right at the top versus middle versus the bottom, it's not a linear thing at all. It drops off like this. And so by the time you get past the second, third, fourth, past the fold, the amount of actual additional kind of promotional juice you can give a piece is fairly limited. And so there is a huge amount of scarcity. And I don't think newsrooms are quite aware of that. I think there's this perception that we just keep producing more stuff and that's kind of winning the internet. And then you start to see these data that show that most of what we produce gets very, very little attention at all. And that's pretty sobering. And so we want to approach this in a fairly systematic, very structured way, and one that's consistent with our new strategy. So I think 4 or 5 months from now, we'll probably have a lot more to say about this.
Sure. I think there's a couple ways to talk about, you sort of talk about short-term and long-term goals, Rasmus, which I think is a really interesting way of thinking about data and how to use it. Short-term is, as Federico was mentioning, is something that's probably more immediately easy to figure out. Short-term is knowing that, for example, we're producing a lot of content right now about Brexit. We know that the audience for our Brexit stories, and again, this is all informed by what we learned from the data, is mostly going to be our UK audience. We know that our UK audience is typically going to be most present on the website early in the morning. So we know that the best time to publish a Brexit story is early in the morning. That's a short-term data-informed decision. Then there's the longer-term data decisions that I think Aaron was alluding to, which are about strategy, right? Well, the strategy for the FT is about what we call quality reach, right? Reaching to audiences that eventually will really get value out of the content, and that might inform Again, the data might inform what platforms we're publishing most on or promoting most on, or what kind of content we're producing most of, because we know that that will inform that strategy, that longer term strategy. But there's another kind of long term, which I think that data is really important for, and that's the cultural and structural change that has to happen in every legacy newsroom if we want to be sustainable, if we want to actually evolve towards a structure and a culture that is digital first and audience first. And data can be really useful for that. Like, you know, Seb, you mentioned earlier measuring everything. I think that's a really good way to think about it. Well, how do you change in the newsroom? You change through experiments. Well, how do you use an experiment to help promote or promote innovation? Well, you measure it, and if it did well, or if by whatever you define the metrics of success, it is a proven success, then that is an example that you can use in the newsroom. For example, our new data tool, we want to get people to use it. We had a previous data tool that had not the most flattering usage numbers in the newsroom. You know, you guys have OFAN and something like 1,000 people use it. Wow. We have much smaller numbers using it, but one of the ways in which we're trying to incentivize the adoption of data by journalists, which is that kind of longer term change, is by encouraging them to use the data tool. You encourage them to use the data tool by being able to allow them to figure out if you do this and that and you search for your name, which is the first thing they do in the data tool. These are all the things that you can figure out about how to actually make sure that your content does better. So it's that kind of short-term, long-term, bigger picture strategy, but also longer-term transformational strategy is what metrics and data can be helpful for.
Sebastian, your set is 8 months old, so by the standards of digital media, by now you're a legacy organization. How have you thought about sort of how data can help you inform your workflow and your organizational design?
Yeah, I was just going to say I'm really proud to hear that we're working the same way as the Guardian and the FT, so it's an honor, yeah. But at least we're asking exactly the same questions about real-time or short-term and long-term. I was just thinking of one other example. I mentioned earlier the list of every article and where they got the traffic from, and we can still do that because we're not publishing as many stories, so we can actually look at every single article we published in March and figure out what worked, what didn't work. But another interesting area for us is to actually see who our audience is. So we launched to reach a very young audience, and we had this kind of like idea persona that we tried to reach, and she was in her early 20s and female. So it'd be interesting for us to figure out if we actually reach that, that person. And now the Facebook data that we have tells us, yes, we do. So our readership is in our early 20s, and it's predominantly female, which is good. It confirms what we set out to do. At the same time, it raises new questions. So maybe we should expand into more male subject, if there is such a thing, to extend our audience. So for us, it's about the content that we produce, but also who are we trying to reach, and are we reaching these people? And that's something where social platforms can also help us, because Facebook gives us some interesting data on that.
I mean, Federica, you did many of the interviews, in particular across the continent on this. I mean, I think one thing that both Renee and her colleagues at the FT talked about, and that one of Aaron's colleagues, Chris Moran, that we interviewed, talked about at The Guardian, is that some of this low-hanging fruit in this area is to use these numbers to make, in retrospect, relatively simple decisions like publish when your audience is awake, which we all sort of giggle at this, but most newspaper websites publish a lot of stuff between sort of 10 at night and midnight, which is with scientific precision, probably the worst possible time you could actually put it out. Why? Well, because that's when you use the file for print. So you interviewed, we don't need to sort of name and shame individual organizations, but you interviewed quite a lot of people across Europe. I mean, do you have sort of thoughts on whether there is room for improvement here for some organizations? Or
Definitely is. I think many newsrooms have some sort of data, even maybe sometimes given to the journalists. So you may receive an email in the morning saying, this is the page views, this is how we did yesterday. Data may even be mentioned in the newsroom meeting in the morning. That's it. Like, whoa, we have a big screen in the newsroom with like real-time graphs. Data is done. Well, that's not exactly true, and especially we said measure everything, don't give too much to the journalists, but explain what you're doing. Because if they don't know what they're looking at, if they don't know, so I think it's a double level. It's strategy, it's culture, but it's also communication to your journalists about what you're trying to do, should they care about that, why that metric is important, like why have we chosen that metric? That requires that you have chosen one metric, so that requires you have a strategy, but once you have it, try to make it accessible, understandable, and turning into action, because in many cases, yeah, they still publish overnight because the mindset and the organization is still kind of print focused, even if they say it's not. Even if you are online, even if you are one of the major online websites in the country, everything else behind somehow still reflects a different environment, a print mindset. So all of these, without a communication, without the training to journalists, without having journalists asking questions, it's pointless because you're never going to get anywhere.
I have one other question, so I'll run by the entire panel, which is sort of built on a point that Sebastian made. So I want to do that, but I want to make sure there is time for more questions or comments from the floor. So, rest assured, if you have a question, you'll get it in. Sebastian said towards the end of your remarks, and I think maybe it would be worth having each of you speak to you, including Federica from the interviews you did, this sort of the issue of moving from using analytics to understand essentially your website. And your app maybe to trying to understand how your journalism is doing across many different platforms, including social, and where you are very reliant on the data that is provided by the platforms to which you publish. I mean, Aaron and Renee and Sebastian, if you have further thoughts on this, and we can hear from Federica too based on the interviews, I mean, how do you try to navigate this issue of using analytics in an environment that's more and more distributed?
So a few ways. So we have a very, very good audience team. It's Chris Moran's team, as Federica mentioned. And over many, many, many moons of trial and error, they have gotten exceptionally good at understanding what works in a particular context. In this case, usually Facebook, but other social platforms as well. And the results are obvious because you can see the impact almost immediately. We have an incredible, as Renee said, we have an incredible real-time data platform called OFAN, which you can see, immediately what the impact is of something that you did on an external platform. And now we've actually started adding into it some of the metrics that we're developing to support our strategy. So we have this notion of regulars. It's not dissimilar at all from the way, in fact, we're stealing shamelessly from the FT and the way they approach this, because they're so much better than we are, and they're so sophisticated at this, and they've been doing it for so long. But we have this notion of regulars, and these are exactly the kinds of readers we want everybody to read The Guardian, but of course, there is an audience, and that is less than 100% of the world. Okay, so that's the first. So there's the first light that has to go off. Who is your actual audience? It's not 100% of the world. Okay, and that sounds silly, but that's honest to God. That's a big step. The next big step that I think we have to get away from desperately. One of the phrases, one of the notions, the concepts that I hope goes away really, really soon is a newspaper website. What is a newspaper website? It's a website that happens to be run by a newspaper. That is, I think, the most toxic, useless term. I think if we stop thinking about a newspaper website, then we get away from this idea that we publish on newspaper timelines, that it's okay to do that. If you think your competitors are other newspaper websites, you and your fellow newspaper websites are probably not going to be around for very much longer. So get away from that. And what are some of the implications of thinking of yourself as a newspaper website? That is, sub parts of your website and your apps. You devote editorial time to manicuring your politics front. Absolutely a waste of time. complete waste of time. An algorithm will do that much better than you can. I'm sorry. It's just true. Also, the traffic there, the amount of people who are actually logging on and saying, honey, let's go and check out the politics section on the Guardian website, is close to zero. Or it's so small, it's just not worth your time. You just sort of have to start being a little more sophisticated. That's not to say we won't find ways to target content to the people who most want it. We just have to do it in more sophisticated ways and less labor-intensive ways and more data-driven ways. So those are two ways I can think of right off the top of my head, and I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Aaron. Renee?
Yeah, I might answer just a slightly different aspect of the question, which is, you know, as increasingly, the newspaper website thing is going away, and we're all going to this kind of post-website publishing world where you're lucky if people come to your website, especially if you just launched, but most likely they'll come not to your newspaper, but to some story or a piece of content on some other platform elsewhere. So how do you integrate all the different data from all the different platforms, Google Analytics, Twitter, Facebook, your own website? How do you get some meaningful, bigger picture? And I think this comes back to what we all keep coming back to, which is, what are my objectives? And it's about reading everything through what is some global, bigger picture strategy, a global bigger picture objective, which means, you know, everything has to be objective driven, which is sort of new to journalism. You know, why am I telling this story in this way? Why am I, you know, our head of interactive desk is here in the audience, and people go to Martin all the time and they say, I really want to do this cool interactive, and Martin's question is, what is the objective of doing this as an interactive? How is the story better told as an interactive? Well, what is my objective of promoting a certain kind of content on a certain platform at a certain time? Well, that is the objective of the media, of the business. And so relentlessly filtering all the editorial choices you're making through the filter of what your strategy and what your objectives are is probably the best way to help make sense of what is otherwise a very scattered, very sort of impressionistic tableau. And it won't always make sense. And it is very iterative and very experimental. And you'll look at something and be like, did that do like that when I thought it was going to do this? And then the next step is one that Federico was pointing out. What, with all these insights, what action do I take? And that's the explanation part to the newsroom and the communication part to the newsroom, which is really, really vital. Data is only so good as the thing I do with it afterwards editorially.
Sebastian, you raised this question and you said that, you know, you look across your performance on different platforms. You said getting the picture from this is really hard. And then I thought, Jesus, if he's got the big picture, you know, I got to speak more to this guy. I don't know anyone else who has the big picture. I mean, how do you think about your performance across all these different channels that you're building on?
Yeah, maybe I was just bragging about having the big picture. I'm trying to get it, and it's very interesting. What it highlights for me is that we have to get rid of this idea that we completely control the distribution channel or access to the readers, but we have to work with partners like Facebook, like other big Silicon Valley companies, and we kind of have to rely on them to deliver our content and reach our audiences. And that raises very important questions about trust and what that relationship looks like. And I think we're in this very interesting phase right now where we define what those relationships are going to look like. So just to give one example, Instant Articles launched and they got some very basic analytics with them. Obviously it'd be interesting to just see more, you know, but how do we talk to Facebook about that? Can we actually, you know, file change requests that we want to see more analytics? Where are these conversations happening, and what data is available? And the other thing is that we spend a lot of time trying to reverse engineer how these platforms work, and that's something you just have to get used to. That's something that's very annoying. So they change an algorithm, and suddenly you don't reach those audiences anymore that you reached the other day. And I think that's just the new normal that we have to get used to.
Federica?
I think a good example of this is what Die Welt has developed, which is called an article score. So they take different metrics. One is page view, one is social share, one is time spent, how the video, if there was a video component in the article, and how that performed. They put it all together and they get a score. It goes from 0 to 20, and that's a way to look at all of it, right? So to understand that page is important, but it's not the only thing, that social share are very important, but that's not the only thing. So they have different criterias, and none of each of the 5 criteria have to have a balance number to get you to 20. That means that's a very effective way to tell journalists and to explain to them how to keep together the big picture, and then they can rate it by different topics and how politics is doing, how sports is doing. But that's, for example, I think it's a very valuable way of trying to look at platform, on-site, off-site, and all the different components to try to get close to having the big picture.
We'll take a last round of questions. So I think Justin at the back, and we have a few more. I'll make sure everyone gets a chance to ask their question.
We have a loyal but engaged audience remaining.
Hi, this is Sylvia Albert from a German public service broadcaster. I've got a question when it comes to the selection of the tools, actually, to the analytics tools. So, are these editorial people who are doing the selection, the implementation and the training for these tools, or are there media research people working together with you, or is there a different department who is going to do some consultation and giving recommendations?
Yeah, The Guardian, it's both. So Chris Moran in the newsroom was working with Graham Tackley on digital development to develop OFAN.
Likewise, it's both, and I think it's really important that there be both. So the audience engagement team at the FT sits in the newsroom, and we have engagement editors and a data analyst who do all of the training. And I think that there's always going to be a way in which it needs to be put into terms for a journalist that is what's in it for me, and that's what the journalist is good at doing, and then it needs to be, but where does this number come from, and how does and how do I make sure that it's accurate? That's sort of what the data analyst can do. But the tag team effect, I think, is useful because that's exactly how we're trying to get journalists to think about, is actually data is relevant and should be coupled with the journalist.
Justin Peters, I want to go back to something that Renee said a few minutes ago about the phrase metrics of success. I think one of the things that discourages a lot of journalists about editorial analytics is that the analytic sort of metrics of success do not always align with a journalist's internal metrics of success. I mean, like, we've all had the experience where we know intrinsically that a story that we've been working on is a really good story. It's well reported, it's well written, or something like that. We can sense this, like, content-wise, is a cut above stuff we've done before. And then to watch that go up on the site and just die, to fall into the bottom sort of 20%, you know, compared against some other piece of content that seems much more fungible, you know, that can be discouraging. So I'm wondering, are there any strategies that anyone at the panel has used or heard of to make the two metrics be more symbiotic? You know, is it merely a question of better communication among the analytics teams and, you know, the journalists, or is there another way to go about that?
Yeah, so that's exactly what we're trying to do now, is add nuance to how we look at everything. Our strategy now is very much about a smaller number. I mean, we'd love to have a huge number, but a smaller number of very committed relationships to The Guardian. And so using that metric, you can look at a piece and say, okay, in aggregate, it did less than, say, this piece on football or this incremental kind of story about Beyonce. But within our target audience, how did it do, right? And so you may have two different perspectives on that. You may see a piece that didn't have a huge number of page views, but among people who really value that kind of journalism, it did exceptionally well. So that's one thing. Two is getting a better sense of, how to put this, of what you're comparing it to. Because look, Beyonce's always gonna win on page views, always. Beyonce's always gonna win on page views. And you can tweet that, by the way. In fact, I would really appreciate it if you did. And actually just say Beyonce's always gonna win. And just that, anyway. that's the problem, is that we have for way too long just looked at clicks as winning, and that is so not the case. So getting away from looking at clicks and clicks alone, number one, looking more at the intensity of the way people look at a piece of content, number two, and choosing the right comparator is number three. But I will say this, sometimes we write a piece and we think it's amazing, and if our readers, even the ones who love us the most, just don't read it, or just it kind of falls flat, sometimes it happens. And sometimes it happens even with content that we love dearly. It's tough, but that's just the fact.
We'll take the two last questions in a row, just to make sure there is a little bit of. So the last two I have is the gentleman here, and then the lady in the front. So.
Hi, it's Samir Padania. I was wondering about if you look to organizations that are maybe even further along, that are sort of digital only, distributed only through social networks, like 140 Journos in Turkey, for example, that publishes and interacts with readers and sources and everyone across, I think it's 17 different social networks of different kinds, visual, textual, long form, short form. I was wondering what you look at for those kinds of, if you look at those kinds of organizations and what they tell you about your direction of travel as different kinds of news organizations. Towards a sort of open journalism, or a different kind of relationship with, not just publishing and watching what happens to that and promoting it, but a more sort of dynamic relationship between people that you're actually reaching and who are telling you things and so on.
And then we'll take the question here in the front, and then.
Hi, I'm Ivy Volan. I head up the digital innovation at a Norwegian regional media house. And I'm just wondering, data are wonderful at helping us evaluate what we're actually doing. But do you in the panel have any thoughts on how data and insight can help us find out what we should be doing more of that we're not doing? Because that's kind of hard to measure.
Two big questions, one from Samir on a sort of fully distributed journalism, and one from on the question of how do you understand things that you aren't doing yet? How can you evaluate that? So, thoughts?
A quick answer for Samir's question. One of the things that I think the publishers are not doing well enough is looking at different platforms. I think we're looking at them as, oh my God, what do we do? And we're not looking at them as opportunities. And what I take away from organizations that are publishing either largely or exclusively via third-party platforms is that we ought to be thinking about that in the same way. Even creating dedicated teams, off-platform teams to even create content for those specific platforms, whether it's YouTube or Facebook or whatever. Snapchat almost requires that. No, Snapchat does require that. Discover will require you to put an entire editorial team together. That's what I see as an opportunity, and I don't think we're taking advantage of that enough.
Just very quickly to add to that, I would also encourage myself and probably everyone else to not just look at journalism, but look at other publishing industries or anyone on the internet who's successful with this, and not just in your own cultural space, but across the world. And I'm personally not doing nearly enough of that, but I think there's people in other industries that have a lot to add to what we're doing as journalists.
Yeah, I might address the second question. How to find out what you're not doing. Again, to sound a bit like a broken record, I think it's relentlessly about, well, what are my objectives? And if my objectives are to reach a bigger audience, and for example, in the case of the FTR audience is predominantly male and predominantly older, so I'd like to reach a younger, more female audience. Well, what am I not doing if I'm not reaching them? And then you experiment, and you measure relentlessly. And you experiment with format, you experiment with covering a topic you didn't typically distributing on a platform you might not have just typically distributed, seeking a kind of engagement, or there are all sorts of things that you might want to try, but you filter it through what are my objectives, and then you measure relentlessly.
I think we are, if we cut it off now, then my real-time analytics inform me that we have a 59% completion rate on an hour-and-a-half long piece of in-depth, long-form content. I think most people in the panel would be very happy with that. So I think we should stop while we're ahead. I'll just end by saying that if you want to know more about this, in addition to paying attention to the people on the panel and other people working in this space, there are hard copies of the report up here. If you want to read the report, it's also available on the Reuters Institute website, so have a look at that. You know, as we said at the outset, it's clear that there are some journalists who worry that analytics leads to worse journalism, more sensationalist, populist, poor journalism. As several people in the panel have said, that is a real risk if you use data poorly. But I will also say, since the panelists are too modest to say this themselves, that they all work at organizations that work very seriously with data and analytics in the newsroom. And if you think that that has made their journalism worse, I would encourage you to pay more attention and spend more time with SET and the FT and the Guardian. So with that, thank you very much to our panelists, to the translators, and to all of you in the audience. Thank you very much. Thanks, Rasmus. Thank you.
Should we just tell them now that we actually have no clue about any of this?
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, get them on the ladder first.
Right.
I mean, you want to sort of initiate them to
Yeah,
the
exactly.
Masonic Lodge before you get to the higher mysteries.
Yeah, I was like, yeah, nobody does anything. Yeah, great questions as always. Do get to the heart of the matter.
Surprised.
It's a tough time. Actually, the questions we did get were pretty good.
I don't have a card, unfortunately.
Alright.
My name is just Aaron. Ask the Guardian. Yeah.
No worries.
Yeah,
no, and I just figured with these guys. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on, is it a large group, or is it just you? Oh, no problem.
It was.
Not a problem.
Good luck.
Just
And welcome to the panel on analytics. I'm Rasmus Kleis-Nielsen. I'm Director of Research at the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism. If any of you are mid-career journalists looking for a chance to spend 6 months in Oxford, have a look at our fellowship program. We also do research which aims to help journalists and the media industry navigate a rapidly changing world. I'm very pleased to have a panel today with Federica Cherubini, who was my co-author on a report we did on analytics earlier this year that's available for download on the Institute website. We also have some hard copies here if people are interested. And some of the people who are leading the development of what we in the report call editorial analytics. So analytics that aren't simply about using numbers to try to generate a few more page views, but about using data to do better journalism and help journalists get that journalism in front of the right people for editorial purposes, but also to underpin the organizational goals of specific news organizations. So Aaron Pillhofer works at The Guardian with these amongst many issues, Renee Kaplan at the Financial Times, and Sebastian Horn at SET, a startup in Zeitverlag in Germany. I'll say just two things before I hand it over to Federica, who will present a few points from the report, and then we'll move around the panel to hear some perspective on how this is done. It's clear, and I think most of you will recognize this from your own professional conversations, that there is a significant number of journalists who are very uneasy about the idea of newsrooms embracing audience data as a way of informing their decision making. And it's long been the case that within news organizations, there was a very asymmetrical situation where the marketing people and the commercial people and management had access to a lot of data and made data-based and data-informed decisions, whereas newsrooms knew relatively little about their audience. Some people think this was a better world. Personally, I'm of the view that as the media environment we operate in gets more and more competitive, not knowing very much about your audience is very, very dangerous if you, as a journalist, want to reach them to make sure that your journalism makes a difference, but also from the point of view of your organization, whether it's a commercial one that needs to make money and hence need to reach people, or whether it's a public service organization that needs to reach the public, hence public service, to justify its existence. How you can use audience analytics to underpin this, Federica will talk about some of the
editorial best practice in editorial analytics. And that means that it is about tools as much as it is about culture and organization. And one is no substitute for the other. So you need good tools. You need to be able to read properly the data. You need to be able to have people understand the data. But you need to have a right place for the data in the organization and a culture that underpins that, not just in management, but throughout the journalists and the organization. Of course, good analytics can help the newsroom understand the audience and to get the people, to get the journalists in front of the right people and more of the right people. But the most sophisticated teams are those who are very aware that analytics are not perfect. Some things are very difficult to measure and to compare. Knowing what good looks like is more difficult than what it can look like. And the data does not speak for themselves. Like numbers, metric need a context. You need an objective, and you have to set the right metric to try to define. Once you have defined that objective, you have to set the right metric to measure it. And that means that benchmarking is very difficult, especially when you're trying to benchmark between different platform, devices, formats. Not all the off-site platform have the same kind of data. And also, we found that the tools and the metric that many newsrooms are still using, not just many newsrooms, the industry is still using tools and metrics that work very well for the internet in 2011, but are not moving fast enough as the industry is moving. So in the report, we advocate for use of data in the newsroom, but we also want to underline that it's not just about following the number and replacing the editorial judgment with just numbers. So it's quite the contrary. It's about taking editorial decisions supported by what the data tells you. And compared to years ago, where the industry had a vague idea of what people were reading and how and what they're doing with the content, now that's possible.
Takeaways from the research we did, and we will hear some perspectives from some of the organizations that are developing this right now. We thought it was very notable as we interviewed across Europe and North America in a range of different organizations, that the use of analytics, which in the past may have been associated with brands like BuzzFeed or Gawker or the Huffington Post, increasingly we see, at least in our view, the most sophisticated analytics work being done by organizations that I think most of us would recognize have a very different value proposition and a very different style and quality of journalism, like the ones represented here today, The Guardian, the Financial Times, SET, but also others, Die Welt in Germany, the BBC in the UK. So tools that some may have associated with a quite frothy type of online journalism are now underpinning some of the best news organizations in the world. And what you think about that as a journalist, I think from my point of view, depends quite a lot on what you think of journalism as a profession and what you think of the people that you are trying to reach. If you think that journalism is perfect and people are stupid, then I can understand why you don't want to know more about what people like and what people want and what people feel make their lives better. Because if people are stupid and you are perfect, then being more informed about what they want will make your journalism worse. Now, I'm a scientist, so I guess I'm in principle open to the proposition that some journalists are not perfect. I hold this up as a hypothesis. I'm not saying that you're not perfect, but I'm willing to entertain the idea that some of you, or some journalists outside this room, are not perfect. I'm also of the view, and I think we have a little bit of evidence to suggest that this is not just a flight of fancy from my point of view. I'm also of the view that not everyone in the audience is stupid. So if you move towards that world where journalists are not perfect and people are not stupid, and you accept that the people you're trying to reach have many, many different offerings competing for their attention, then it may actually be quite useful to know something about them and what they are doing, what's the context in which they use your content, your journalism, what are the ways in which they feel that it adds value to their life, informs them, empowers them, make their lives better. And I think we see some very clear examples of that now being done in sophisticated organizations across Europe and North America, where analytics is used not to override editorial.
So that's just one further element to really be able to build an editorial, to make an editorial decision around it. And it's important for us that journalists also take this seriously, because the alternative is not a word with no analytics. It's impossible right now to just stop thinking that we are gonna look at the data. But the alternative is analytics shaped by advertising, commercial, tech companies that have very little interest in good journalism. So that's why in the report we really advocate for a presence of the journalist sphere into this field.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Federica. We'll hear now from some of the people who are developing these tools for editorial and organizational purposes across different organizations. So I think we should start with you, Aaron, and hear from The Guardian, from the front lines.
All right. So I'm just going to talk for a couple of minutes because we want to have a lot of time for questions, and I know we're going to have a lot of questions because this is always a very contentious topic, particularly with among journalists. And actually, maybe every time I say that, you know, sometimes that is the case. Sometimes you get into these discussions about, oh my God, data is evil. You give it to the newsroom, and the world is going to stop rotating, and the sky is going to fall, and everything's going to end, and your site's going to turn into nothing but cat videos. And so, having been in an organization that felt that way for 9 years, and having had conversations there that would blow your mind about how journalists think about data and how they think people are interacting with their content. I mean, just things that are just totally made up. Things, you know, this is the problem. When data is not inherently evil, right? Data is just data. Data that its limitations, as long as you understand what it is good for and what it's not good for, it isn't inherently evil. How we use it, it could be evil. So this is fundamentally the problem, I think, in newsrooms, is in some respects, it's not necessarily always the lack of data. It's often the abuse of data, or laziness, I would even say, around data. Does it align with your strategy? Does it align with your editorial strategy? How you use data, does that actually, do you know you're moving your organization to some defined point? Do you even know what your editorial strategy is? Does anyone know?
Editorial decision making, but to inform it and to empower journalists to become better journalists and get their journalism in front of more of the right people. So I think we'll hear some examples of this from the panel, and then I hope we'll have a good discussion, because I think there is a useful tension, if you will, between more data-informed perspectives and journalistic priorities, but also one where it's worth looking for common ground looking forward. So with that, I'll hand it over to Federica.
Thank you, Rasmus. So we spoke to dozens in newsroom working with analytics, people with title like audience editor and audience engagement, audience development editor, growth editors, to try to understand, to have a picture of what people are doing and what direction are they taking. And we defined editorial analytics as the approach that moved beyond the generic use of off-the-shelf tools to develop a tailored approach that is aligned with the editorial priorities and the organizational structure of each organization. So a tailored approach means that you know what you're trying to do, you have a strategy, and you use the data to underpin that. That means not just using the tools, because there is no shortage of tools. So many newsroom, almost all newsroom are using some sort of analytic tool, either developed in-house or Charbit, NewsWeb, Parsley. That's not a problem anymore. But many newsrooms still use that in a very regimental way, and they not really go beyond a daily plug-and-play tool that is focused on just a short-term optimization, moving the content around the homepage, trying to optimize the headline, but they not really combine with the long-term goals. Also, best practice are those that acknowledge that the field is in constant evolution and data has some limits. So we found 3 criteria that underpinned